me just check the Twitch stream. This channel has no content. Yeah. Should be going. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, you want me to start with the intro? Should we give it a minute?
Yes.
Or yeah, okay.
Okay, we're on.
Okay. And I'll just add in the chat on the Twitch at least, let us know if the audio is messed up. I have some minor adjustments I can do over here. But yeah, welcome to the very first installment of this series between okno.one and Archive Acts, which is Crystal's curatorial umbrella. And yeah, we're calling it Archives as Reparative Technology, the series. And this is artists archiving artists. And so, yeah, the idea is we're going to have 3 conversations. So this is the first. The second is December 5th with Tia Simone Gardner and the artist Latipa. We're calling that Geo Archives. And then we have December 12th at 2 p.m. is Ritual Archives with Jessica Harvey and Candice Lynn. And so kind of the ideas we'll have 3 conversations kind of exploring these different segments of archival practice. And in this case, we have Jina Valentine and Heather Hart of Black Lunch Table and Hailey Loman of Los Angeles Contemporary Archive, which are 2 sort of, I mean, we'll get into it, but artist-run archival projects that are really impressive in their kind of scale and structure and ambition. And yeah, so we're excited to talk about these sort of archives outside of traditional institutions today. And so I think that's it for my intro. Crystal, do you have also? We just started a Patreon, patreon.com/okno1 to support future projects, and this series is sponsored by the Oklahoma Visual Arts Council, and so we're very grateful for that. So yeah.
Thanks, Lucas, for that intro. And thanks to Jina, Heather, and Hailey for being here with us today. We're very honored to have these guests with us online and to think through their practices, respectively, the Black Lunch Table, which has been around since 2005, and LACA with Hailey. So maybe we can just start by introducing our audience to a short description of what each practice is. Hailey, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is wonderful. So Los Angeles Contemporary Archive started in 2013. And I have a background in performance art and am really invested in ephemeral works and how can we celebrate research heavy artwork. And so me and Eric Kim of Human Resources Gallery, we were thinking, well, what does a space look like where you walk in and you can immediately understand that this isn't that this is residue from a performance, that a performance happened and has now ended, and you missed it if you didn't come, and that this was a place now to access what happened. And I was really struggling making work. I know Eric Kim had a vastly different experience where he was thinking, all this activities happening in Human Resources Gallery. What comes next? Whereas I was really thinking about how can we walk in and not look at ephemera on a pedestal and think, oh, this is a new object that's for sale. So a place to celebrate unfinished work. And so we built LACA. And another thing that we were, constantly thinking about was why an archive in Los Angeles on the east side of LA when the GRI exists, and that's the Getty Research Institute. And these are extremely exclusive places that take on that require degrees to access them, that have hours that are associated with an institution that maybe you are that you pay dues to enter. And so we wanted to make a place that was vastly different than that. So LACA holds art ephemera, meaning studio, residue, performance, and then it has a non-circulating library of artist books.
Great. Thank you, Crystal and Lucas.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, we're really excited to be in conversation with you, Hailey. So I guess maybe we're talking a little bit about origin. I think right now, Jina and I came together over many things, but I think one was the lack of access we had to records of Black visual artists that were contemporarily working as we grew up in our respective cities, whatever, 3,000 miles away from each other. We met, as Crystal said, in 2005 at Skowhegan, artist residency, really idyllic space in the woods with 65 residents and no self-segregation at that point. So I think in our 20s, we were feeling exploratory and trickster and thinking about perception and language and communication. And we decided to segregate the lunchroom. And I think at that point, there was multiple things that happened. I think one was generative conversation that we really didn't plan for nor have a plan for at that point. So eventually talking about things like, do we show in February? Or is that like ghettoizing our career? And then another thing that happened was pushback from really close white friends that we had, thinking about why we were being so subversive in an idyllic space. But that also, I think, broke open a deeper level of friendship for us, having to really confront the systematic differences that we respectively carry around with us. Jina, do you wanna?
Yeah, I think that's about right. And then after we had to leave Eden, after we got kicked out of the garden, we went to grad school, and we were both reflecting on how the populations in our grad programs did not look like us. There were very few of us. And so we, back in the very early days of Skype, spent a lot of time fighting with the technology, but managed to bring together the Black populations at 5 different grad schools for our conversations. And we also had meetups and Skillshare workshops, and had less formal Black lunch table, I guess, programming happening during that time. And in 2014, we participated in the Black Artist Retreat, which was something that began at Dorchester Projects here in Chicago. And in that convening, we're like, this is a really kind of amazing opportunity to see what it would be like to have a number of these conversations happening at one time. So I think at that one we had 5 or 6 tables at a time, rotating over the course of 3 hours maybe. and kind of curated people into conversations with each other and gave them conversation prompts and recorded the audio from those roundtables. And that's kind of morphed into what we have carried forward as our format for roundtable events. I guess I could flash forward slightly because this could be a very long story, but we also do something called the People's Table, which is a community roundtable. The artist table is for Black artists. The People's Table is for everyone in the local community to join, and kind of seeks to like cross-pollinate conversations around social justice issues, or yeah, loosely. And we are building an archive. I don't know if you want to talk about the archive and about Wiki.
Sure. So I think another little node that happened at the Black Artist Retreat was we had been, thinking about Wiki as a potential site for these kind of discursive and spaces, this self-authorship that we've been thinking about, that our project had kind of snowballed into. And we set up our very first editathon there, which was a hot mess, but we definitely learned a lot. Um, and I think with that and beginning to apply for grants, we really kind of coagulated what the project is today. So we now host these same roundtables that our Inception project began, but in 2014 or so, we also added a People's Table, which is integrated and inspired by that need for the form that we were providing, but in that cross-pollinated context, because of the killings of so many Black people. And we realized that, in order to think about that original goal of access, that we wanted to have these recordings transcribed and metadata tagged and start building like a dynamic searchable database of this information. So we have a beta site up now, and you can go in and look up the keyword and see where in all of our history of conversations people mentioned that word in Johannesburg and Seattle and New York, and jump right that conversation and see what people were thinking about that concept. We're thinking a lot in the coming year about linked open data and crowdsourced metadata tagging. So I think we've probably spoken too long, but yeah, that's our project.
I think Lucas had a question about data for you. Lucas, do you want to, since you've gone there, we should probably follow up on that.
Yeah, I can interject. One thing that LACA does that is a bit different is that artists or our donors write in their descriptive metadata. Keywords are have always been a source of contention at LACA. We have an oral history arm, autonomous oral history group, where, yes, similarly, if you say something, it gets placed as a keyword. That can be troublesome because if someone goes on a tangent about potatoes, suddenly they are in a keyword with a potato farmer. And what does that look like? But at LACA, artists, like the person that donates the material is writing their own descriptions, therefore shaping their own narrative and making a conscious choice about how they're being framed. And that's really integral to LACA, um, that you can kind of see that the artist always takes hierarchy. So I may write something in, or the curator of a show may generate some tags, but at the end of the day, the artist is going to kind of trump that. And it's so interesting that you brought up Wikipedia. We've done kind of like women-oriented editathons, women in queer, and at LACA, and that was a really big source of inspiration, that you could see the edits, like this person added a comma and then another user added this, and there was a track of this internal archiving made public. And it's important to us that you then see that the artist takes precedent. So that's one way that we've kind of wrapped our head around keywords. Of course, I joke that we make these rules and then all of our rules get broken. So there are, amazing circumstances where things have where that hasn't happened. We had a volunteer in the space that would keyword items as, when I went to look back over them, as fabulous or sparkly, and it became its own. I was like, oh no, what are we gonna do? Like, we have like 20 records that say sparkly and it doesn't look sparkly to me. And there was something so endearing about it that they felt that it was sparkly. Well, what do? I mean, the artist donating trumps this, but there's always room for these like kind of poetic accidents that we kind of negotiate. I mean, that's what we wanted LACA to be, both a functioning archive as well as a place where we could talk about what is, like, hold an archive open as a question.
Yeah, I would say, your question about like what are the qualities for this required for doing this metadata tagging archiving. I would say a little bit of insanity, honestly, OCD. But I also think we would agree with Hailey. I think that one of the most important ways that we retain that kind of mission of self authorship is, before we even start that conversation, everyone fills out their audio release along with a 10 question questionnaire that self-identifies these meta tags we use in conjunction with their person. We also have a team of metadata taggers. Right now we have 2, I think, and then 2 transcribers. We never fall below 2 because we want it to have some checks and balances and not ever be framed with one perspective. Our goal in the next year or so is working with our web developer to develop something that maybe looks a little bit like SoundCloud, so people can kind of sign in and live tag as they're listening. We've also been playing around with the idea of using machine technology as an analogous metadata tagging, just so that you can visibly see the difference between self-identifying and what the big data would tag something as. So I don't know, Jina, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add, like, the how do we do this? That's a really good question. I think we'd like to throw into some of our grants that, like, yo, we're artists. This is how we're doing these things. These are the things we need. We need someone to hold all of our raw audio. There's a place that does that. The Carolina Digital Repository is holding onto our raw data and like doing whatever magic they do there to keep it from going corrupt. The archive.org has been a great resource for like hosting, and they're also kind of like down to experiment with changes and figure out what works for the info, the sites, the projects that they're hosting. And our digital developer. Is that what we call him now? He's had a number of different titles. Maybe that's a good example of like how we've been sort of nimble and kind of changing things as necessary. But he's basically the architect of our archive. His ideas about the potentials for linked open data have really, sorry, child and cat in the background here. But it's just been kind of dreaming about like what linked open data could do, and has been referring to like the metadata tags as like buckets. So if we have like all of this content that we're putting in this bucket, what do we call the bucket? What if, you know, the Library of Congress has similar information, and they're calling their bucket something else, or like they have similar information, they don't know that they need a bucket called this particular thing. Like linked open data could, you know, give us an opportunity to not just provide the content, but also provide like the terms for organizing that content in our archive and also other archives, which is really cool. I don't know if that answered your question.
I would also just add, maybe in general, from I'm sure this is true from all three of us, is like we're all artists first, and I think that the one piece of training that I think we all get is how to be innovative problem solvers. um, so we just make things happen. I don't know any other career that necessitates wearing so many hats. So I think, at least for Gina and I, we have big vision and dreams, and then we assemble people and grants and things to make sure that that can take form.
Yeah, just following up on that, Heather, thinking about the ways in which language is so important in constructing this data and linking this data to larger forms of knowledge and sort of interrogating those forms of knowledge. Um, I wanted to go back to the way that you were speaking about being an artist first. Lucas and I were having these conversations about, you know, whether these practices, Black Lunch Table and LACA, are practices that you consider art forms for yourselves, or is that some other entity? I'm sure this conversation has maybe evolved or changed for you over time. It's been a very long time for Black Lunch Table. And so I'm curious about sort of the evolution of this organization versus art practice.
I I've had to do really strict for myself and my sanity, very strict roles of right now I'm doing custodianship and now I'm doing authoring. Um, and I actually find it ethically troublesome for my own practice when they start to blur. Although it's exciting when artists blur those lines. For me to be a good custodian and take care of something is really in contrast or conflict with authorship. And so I have thought of at LACA, it's like, well, what did I make? Because, for example, when Young Jin Kwok has donated their collection of performance outfits and their stilettos and bikinis, that's I am not going to put that into a gallery and say that that's mine. But I would say that the container, not the contents, is something that I've created as an artist. So I have considered the role of the programmer, the archivist, the director, and how we work together and shape things. Things like our deed of gift, our accession documents, where we kind of play with language and think about roles and how we're negotiating things when they come in, and those kinds of documents to me is the organization, and that I build art organizations as an art practice, but the actual insides, I'm very careful to separate those. Um, yeah, it's just something I've had to wrap my head around.
Yeah, I think that Gina and I would probably have different answers. I think that lunch table kind of sits between in the middle of the overlap between Gina's and my practices. And I have quite a bit that is outside that kind of Venn diagram, but I think our interest naturally came together in access and oral histories and language and interpretation. And I think that in my private practice, I I make things, but in addition to that, I'm also using, I guess, uh, like choreography, directing. I don't have a name for it. This whole like catalyzing as a medium, and so I think lunch table sits very close to that part of my practice, but it's not. It doesn't. I don't have. Yeah, I feel like you're right that there's definitely a separation there, and now that it's a nonprofit, it's growing even further away from my personal practice, I think. Gina, what would you say?
Um,
It really is. It's the same.
I'm not really, yeah. I would say that yeah, there are definitely overlaps between, you know, the various areas of my life that I consider part of my practice. But they always kind of change. Like they're already blurry and they're always kind of moving. If that makes sense. Uh,
It's hard for me to think about art as authorship, even though I can see that. I just feel like I'm constantly resisting the idea of art as making things. Um, yeah.
yeah. No, I mean, I would say that the BLT informs the way that I go about my independent practice. In some direct ways, and it informs me teaching in some direct ways, and that works both ways too, but those things are always kind of changing as all of those things develop. Sorry, that was a really abstract, evasive answer, but I think it's a great question because I don't have a definite answer for it.
Thank you. Or
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that's integral to LACA is that while we push back on conventional archives, we are also a repository that does this task and service. So that is really, I think of Import Export Funkhouse, Adrian Piper, or Marcel Brotier's, and these examples of artists making organizations, and they didn't exactly go the full extent. I mean, yes, those archives. Are they artworks? They're kind of blurry in between. Do you go and access the Eagle Museum and check out an eagle statue? Or do you, I mean, Adrian Piper's works at MoCA, I don't know if there's other ones. I just know of that one. And I think we wanted to actually be a functioning archive. And so in that way, I've had to create that separation. And so when I make something, I mean, while I'm like deeply pushing back on physical objects and much more like how to make something, how to archive a relationship, how to archive a mood. It's if that's something that I have wrapped my head around, that I've made it from scratch. I don't know if I would put it in the stacks. It's like I've had to, and it's not that I don't support artists going in and, I mean, artists going into archives and pulling things and making artworks on top of them. I mean, I have issues always with consent. Like, did that person say that I was okay? I don't care that they're dead. But I can't wrap my head around that in terms of like, to me, that's a collaboration where there's a hierarchy and so maybe you're co-creating without that person's consent. That it's just a structure that I've had to create to kind of quell my anxieties.
Yeah, it sounds like part of what you're talking about is like, yeah, the idea that if the archive becomes an art practice, it somehow has to no longer function in this functional archive, or has to have some like twist, maybe, like, versus like anything an artist does is a art project. Like anything I do under my banner as a person is it doesn't, I, not that those are the proper definitions to be going off of, but I don't know. Well, here, I wanted to, well, maybe we can resolve some of these questions as we move on, but yeah, just kind of moving in a different direction. You just talked about like archiving conversations, archiving performance ephemera, and wanted to ask about the idea of how does archiving something shift the perception of its value? Like, does the act of archiving automatically enter something into, this is a different question, but like, does it automatically turn it into history? Does it, does that become a piece of history through that moment, or does it give it an authority that, like, kind of this idea of what shifts once you enter something into the archive?
I mean, I think for us, obviously we don't have a physical collection. We collect memories or ideas, and I think that we are constantly saying that it's never static. So we want it to be a living archive. We want it to be impressionable and accessible and like transform with every listener and edition. You were going to say something, Gina.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that I think, yeah, that is a weird thing that happens, right? Like once something is entered into an archive, it's like authenticated, that it has some value. And I think that's a lot of why we do what we do. Like recording it makes it, primary source material. It's recorded and putting it in an archive. It's sort of equivalent to publishing it, right? And hopefully it'll make it citable and um, excerptable, if that's a word.
And it's also like an open call. Like we don't ever like do invites to particular people per se. Like we
Right.
invite anyone to self-identify and come.
I was also thinking of Susan Stewart's on longing, and her chapter on the collection and the miniature. I'm thinking about like what happens to something that's entered into a collection, or like why we collect things and what it says about us, right? And maybe it goes back to the previous question about, which I think was about the objectivity of an archive. Like, if as an artist creating an archive, are you an artist with an archive and you're like a neutral entity and like formulating that thing, or are you like an artist with like some purpose, and you're the objects in the collection are always going to be kind of serving your purpose, right? And I think maybe Stuart would have said like that's the difference between like a personal collection and actually, no, I think she would have said that it was your personal collection, right? Like it's about you and your interests, right? So, she says that like, a compliment to one's collection is really a compliment to the self or something like this. But like, or if somebody says that that object doesn't really seem like it fits your collection, it's also like a critique on the collector. And yeah, I'll stop there with the theory. But I also wanted to add just like wiki, like putting people, like entering articles into wiki definitely, has the it also authenticates in a way that person, like when you Google an artist and one of their first hits is their wiki entry, it tends to validate them in a way, right? So
Yeah, and in that in going off of that, I mean, whenever we archive something, we're inevitably choosing not to archive something else or to spend our time doing that. And so dedicating that labor. So I think that that can be wielded in in good ways. I mean, in the oral history group that we have, it's very much about what's fact versus fiction. Does it matter? I mean, in this case, we don't care who gets validated in a system and who doesn't. Um, and why, when it's a record, somehow it's factual, whereas when certain folks say things, it's myth. But at the same time, I mean, I'm all for demystifying this value that happens. May it be a record with another together, and so that as a collection is now important, or it's really old, so it's important, or it's been appraised and now it has extreme value. I consult at some estates, an archive, like a social justice archive in South Central, and I mean, sometimes I'll go down and they're like, "Ooh, the archivist, what are they doing?" And it's like, I have a pencil and flashcards. Like, this is, I mean, like, like, I do not want this to become some sort of epic costume I'm wearing, because it's not. I can show you how to do this. This part isn't like, I refuse to make it appear rocket science-esque. So I teeter between the two. LACA has been looking towards reappraisal policies and how that's one way to make things more fluid and less set in stone. I mean, a record usually gets appraised once in its lifespan. What's it like to be constantly relooking at this and thinking about what's going on, what's it next to, how does it change, how do we document all the different appraisals of value and movement? We haven't found a way for that to be as radical as we'd like it to be, other than just how, what's it like to just redo it? So those are things we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. Like, how do you appraise? What is the value of an oral history? Right. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reworking our oral history consent form, and we've been thinking about that because so much of it's done in trade, and then a lot of these, like, I've been seeing a lot of these post-colonial strategies of oral history work and of oral history consent forms. And it's like you go in and the institution and the oral historian don't own the archive. Instead, that community does. But does that community even want it? Like, it's so presumptuous that they want to take care of it, that they have those structures built. It's such a centralizing extreme flip, that I've been trying to create a consent form where it's like, you're intertwined now, you both have co-ownership and you both have to talk to each other. I mean, that's one way to maintain ties in the archive, like how you're just stuck with having to, you have equal stock in it. But yeah, valuing shared experience becoming memory and creating a value to that is just a wild thing to wrap our heads around.
That's so interesting, Hailey. I'm thinking a lot about, what you're saying in terms of the appraisals, and also thinking back to Heather's introduction about sort of sitting in and sitting out, to sort of find community in spaces that are not always welcoming, or spaces that don't always reflect the values that you hold or the values that you share, and how to sort of incorporate or sort of embed that into the spaces that we find ourselves in as artists. And it's making me think a lot about sort of, the way that um, maybe time and consent and posterity. And I'm trying to understand in some way, um, our intentions in these particular moments may be viewed very differently over time, right? And some of these archives that we're referencing or we're thinking about maybe had good intentions when they started, but perhaps didn't realize um, what they were capturing, were very sort of white supremacist mentalities or hyper-colonial mentalities. And archives don't always archive the things that we think we're archiving, right? In the way that you were talking about glitter and sparkly, um, those terms. So I'm wondering about maybe some of the consequences that you've encountered in this practice, if you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Maybe you could say that question one more time.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'm just curious about maybe some of the what are some of the unintended consequences of working with archives in the way that you've worked with them?
I mean, I can talk about ours a little bit. That echo of that first lunch table, you know, despite what Gina and I actually like want or intend, there's always going to be um, people who feel like they're entitled to be in affinity spaces that they claim to not identify with. And although I feel like in that 2005 table, everyone in that camp was our friends, we felt close to. And so anyone who we were excluding, we came from a common place before that action, and we were able to go back to that common place and process this kind of performance, right? And and communicate and grow together. And that was, we knew what our intentions were. We had a common desire and frame of reference in that way. But now that this is a public action and archive, um, we've had to stop and think about what are the parameters. Can we say no? When do we say no? How do we say no? And wi- you know, because one person has the power to kind of disrupt that entire archive potentially. So when do we come in with a heavy hand? And like the original lunch table, basically our invitations were based in perception, and I would never have been invited to the Black lunch table had I not been the author of that. So that echoes forward. I think it's like when someone who is white passing comes to the Black lunch table, Gina and I have to say to ourselves, okay, is this my frame of reference? Is this person here intentionally? If they are here intentionally, are they here maliciously? And then we have to figure out how, as an organization, we proceed with this um, action. And I think we've only had like stressful situations 2 or 3 times, but they're significant and they echo into the policy that we hold, like, and we create in terms of that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, and negotiating all those things is wild. I mean, I think that we've dealt with a lot of like who feels safe in archives and who doesn't, and when are we catering to which. I mean, archives and organizing collections is such a privilege to have the kind of time and grooming and wants and desires to do that, that frequently we get a lot of materials from people who feel as though there's something entitled about it. Like I need to dump my stuff here because you're gonna want this. And so we do get a group of people consistently coming in, and it's just like, we take everything at LACA, but how do we make it feel safe when those materials are also there? I mean, I've been reading some of Britt Russett's, which is like Disappointment in the Archive, and what's it like to walk in and just be totally disappointed by what's in the stacks and what isn't there, and then to make up what's there because it's just not there. And something that's been really binding and interesting between everyone that volunteers and works at LACA is that none of us have robust collections. My family wasn't able to bring anything. Like, it's all an American assimilation story. There's nothing from the old country. And what, like, is that why we're doing this? And then people who come in with their like family's Mayflower materials and they want to talk about it. So yeah, it's a constant struggle to be both a welcoming space that takes everything, but doesn't that also monitors that, because that's not what we're going for. That's not in our mission. That's not the greatest answer, but it's definitely something we're constantly reflecting on.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about sort of, thank you for those answers. It's making me think a lot about, it's going back to what you were saying, Haley, about power in a way, and the appraisal of power, and sort of thinking about how we fashion ideas of value and importance to things, and we want other people to value them. Um, and I'm thinking about what you mentioned with Susan Stewart's writing, Jina, on collecting, and sort of collecting as sort of mirroring those values, and sort of really manifesting those values in a form that other people might be able to see or experience. Um, I was really curious about sort of the ways. One of our questions that Lucas and I had, sort of in the background, was thinking about the ways in which you work with and collaborate with other organizations. And Haley, you mentioned that there was a collaboration in the beginning, and Gina and Heather are obviously collaborating now, but also work with Wiki. Um, so I'm curious about, maybe if you can talk about, maybe there are people in the audience or who will watch this later who are interested in sort of expanding form and thinking about the ways in which they can collaborate with organizations that have historically, um, not held these practices to high esteem, and sort of how to shift that narrative and make these sort of repairs in the archive.
Yeah. Um, Something that we've been that always kind of charmed me was that really good long-term preservation is that you are mirrored at other archives, that your backup is somewhere off-site, maybe at another archive, and then you take their backup. And I love this idea that, I mean, for example, Lucas, you brought up K-Chung Radio. We're just a mirror for them to hold their items. When you're on K-Chung Radio's site, you stay on K-Chung Radio. We haven't gone in and plundered their files and taken them to our file hosting back end, but we both can, we both mirror each other so you can access it on either sites. And what kind of collaboration that looks like is so gentle and thinks about these long-term fatalist things. And yeah, I mean, I think that that is something charming in that each person's taking care of, or an organization takes care of another organization, and another one makes sure that the other one, it's a mutual aid sort of thing so that we all survive. And I think that there's a way, you know, we've gone in and made, have consulted and done consent forms for the Autry Museum. And LACA can be a little pilot project where we trial out these things, because we don't have this massive multi-year collection that has a board that everyone needs to, we can pilot and try out stuff. And then when people get more comfortable, they can go and bring those into their institutions. So, I mean, that's been one really successful thing that has been able to happen.
I feel like we just wouldn't exist without collaboration. I think like everything is about collaborating for us, from, you know, the people who generously contribute their voices to the archive, to the institutions who host us and share their communities with us for that moment, to the whoever, like archive.org and Carolina Digital Repository, who keep the back end behind the scenes stuff, to our team members and people who come to work on Wikipedia with us. And those people in Wikipedia, I think, are really great examples of standards of collaboration because of the philosophy of open source platforms and sharing. So I think even though people think Wikipedia is kind of a, a cold and anonymous encyclopedia, we have found that actually editing is very much about people and collaborating. So I don't know. We would not exist at all and not be sustainable without a deep, deep level of collaborating with everybody.
I would maybe also add, yes, absolutely, 100% true. I think I would also add that, like, between the participants, people are always, seated at tables with strangers, and the conversations that start at the tables always seem to happen, into the future beyond the table. So hopefully there's some collaboration we don't know about, or some conversations that are continuing after that. And I was also thinking about, the programming, the coding that has gone into creating our site, and how we have Black Lunch Table on GitHub, or we talk to people at the Media Lab at University of Maryland, who are like, yeah, we don't actually have answers to these questions, but let's chat and like try to figure this out together. Let's invent the tools that we need to do. But it's been kind of amazing that everyone is open to share knowledge.
Thank you for those answers. We have about 5 minutes in case there's anyone watching who'd like to pose a question to our guest today. In the meantime, I'd love to know sort of what direction you'd like to take LACA and Black Lunch Table in the future, sort of maybe the dream version of your project.
I mean, I think we mentioned wanting to have a capability to crowdsource metadata tagging, that's for sure. You know, we see the project is totally scalable too, so we would love the form to be able to grow to encompass different gaps, I guess.
Yeah, and I would just add maybe extending the collaborative possibilities. So thinking hard about linked open data and also collaborating with other projects, maybe physical archives like LACA.
Definitely.
I mean, my question is, how do you even? I mean, maybe it's because I'm in New York, but how do you even space? Like, how do you keep everything that anybody will donate? Like, and where? Like, well, what?
Yeah, it's pretty, I mean, in some ways, it's like, are we bursting at the seams? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. Do I have some Barbara Kruger cookies in my freezer to my right? Yes. So I don't know. We we're kind of, I like to think of it that we're kind of this some of these organizations we pick at, like scrappy sister. We get the Getty's hand-me-down mylar sheets and folders. UCLA had a film shoot and we got a bunch of boxes that, I mean, that's like you said, Heather, like we're all artists, and so like somehow we survive. Uh, so I mean, I love that we can complain about these places and take their hand me downs. Um, but yeah, we have a physical space. I mean, I've been laughing while I've seen so many nonprofits in LA get rid of their space during the pandemic. I'm like, oh, we can't do that to cut costs. We are we're archiving right now, so this is something that happens 24/7. It's sitting safely preserved. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think for future, we're really looking at that artists writing their own descriptive metadata, which has suddenly become this new record that we've co-created with someone. So now it's an oral history record. Now what? Right now we're working on a lot of like, how can we embed reflexivity, or how do we add in an archivist note into all of these entries? Like, so that we aren't this floating head or this body that you know is in the room archiving stuff, but you don't really know what they're thinking. I was reading a suffragette oral history collection, and the artist's note was so particular. It was like the clinking of our teacup and saucer when the rain poured when we began our interview. And it was like, oh, so it had a saucer with your cup. Got it. So these are such like, I mean, there's class notes in there. Like you glean so much from who is this person that's interviewing this other person from that artist note. So we've been thinking about writing those when we're done, writing recaps and thinking of biases and how that can transform each record and where I've come from and how that relates to what I'm doing. So that's kind of what we're forward thinking and working on.
I'm totally interested in like staying in this conversation with you too, because I'm like thinking now of all these questions about capacity building too. Like, how do you like that is all like like subjective. Like, I love that. That's I think we're thinking about that too. Like, how do
Yeah.
you add the subjective into these categories and
Yes,
organizational
so
systems?
grateful that we've gotten to speak, and I hope to keep it. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. And please do continue that conversation. I just wanted to go to the chat. We had one question from Claire Jimenez. For artists who are interested in learning more about digital archives, but may feel intimidated by technology, where do you recommend they start to learn?
That's a good question. um,
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yes. For other artists who are interested in learning more about digital archives, but may be intimidated by technology, where do you recommend they start to learn?
I would be
I mean,
curious, Gina and Heather's response to
yeah,
that.
I don't know. I mean, I think like that digital space, you're going to have to probably get on a computer. So, but I understand that. I mean, the one thing I'd say that Wiki is great for example, is that there is no messing it up. It like every action is stored, so it's like literally one click of a button to undo what you did. And also like millions of people around the planet are like checks and balancing things. So if you mess something up and it stays there, someone will undo it, like no worries. And so I guess I always recommend taking a deep breath and coming to a Wikipedia editathon in person or on virtually, I guess, if they're interested in archiving in that way. But accessing something digitally, I don't know, it feels like not a Luddite versus expert thing to do. It feels like you can just poke around, you know?
Hailey or Gina, did you want to add anything to that?
I would say I'm pretty daunted. I'm working on this massive archive in South Central that I found out doesn't have an online database. They've been kind of heroes of mine, and I'm just like, wait, nothing. You've been around for 50 years, nothing's online. And I mean, I've had that at the Chinese Historical Society right by LACA that we work with. Often I asked to see their online database, and they handed me this like this dirty binder, and they were like, "This is it. This is as good as it gets." And yeah, I mean, so I've been looking at like what are the like free sites. We made LACAs from scratch on Drupal, but it's like um, what would be really easy for anyone, and um, I mean, Microsoft Excel we use that sometimes for tiny collections that aren't going to live at LACA, and we have to wrap our head around like, well, we don't know where they're going to go forever, but we need to make a list. I mean, it's a glorified list. Of course, it does a lot more things. You have then a container list, and then you have unique identifiers and accessioning sheets, of course, but I mean, it's also a glorified list. And so text edit, can you make a list? I mean, it's as daunting as you want it to be, um, and as simple as you want it to be. And there's
Totally.
free places, yeah.
I would just add, yeah, spending some time hanging out on your local online archives, trying to find stuff. My students have to do that, and I think they like it. But that's a good way to get started. Or a digitize-a-thon is also really fun. Just like going through boxes, yeah, the dirty binders, going through lots of boxes of stuff and scanning it and photographing it and cataloging. But yeah.
Yes, maybe we can take that question on later. A big thank you to Gina, Valentine, and Heather Hart of Black Lunch Table, and Hailey Loman of LACA for sharing their well-versed takes on archival practices. We've asked these artists to join us today in deep admiration of their individual and collective work and practices, and the ways in which their collective work contributes and shapes the machine of memory. Throughout this series of three conversations, We'll continue to explore how artists continue to reshape the now into both living and historical record. Thanks for joining OK.1 and ArchiveX.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Just the beginning of a conversation.
To be continued.
Yeah, that was really fun. And yeah, great
Then
meeting you all.
I have Rex for you.
Do you? That would be
Yeah.
amazing. I
Okay,
want to
bye.
figure it out.
Yes, good to see everyone and take care.